Right now, you're looking at an innocent man currently awaiting execution. 7 years ago, the DNA on the murder weapon was finally tested and proved it was not his.
Whoever handled this knife left DNA. It is not Marcellus Williams.
His execution was stayed by the then governor, and a panel was convened to reassess his conviction.
Today, a panel will work to decide if that evidence proves Williams is innocent.
So, why is he still here?
How innocent do you have to be to avoid being executed?
This is an injustice, it's wrong. The evidence shows my dad is innocent.
The closer you get to execution, the stranger things get.
This interview remains the only one Marcellus has been able to give on camera from death row.
Right now, as you see, I'm sitting in prison on death row.
My friend Noah did it 6 years ago while working on a documentary about Marcellus' son's boxing career.
He's aspiring to be the champion. I believe, and he feels that if given a chance, he will be the heavyweight champ.
I'm his only child, his son. I'm a professional fighter, but I've been fighting my whole life outside the ring.
Because of the fighting outside the ring, his boxing career was cut short, and as such, so was Noah's documentary. Fast forward 6 years later, Marcellus is still in death row. Noah comes to me with the work he's done so we can make this piece that you're watching right now. Noah gave me a rundown of what he was able to capture over the time he was working on his documentary.
Sat down with him for a few hours and just talked. And from there, just started diving in.
And then I flew to Missouri to follow up and to figure out what has been happening since he sat down with Marcellus. It's an unbelievable story that has to be heard, and one that is still hard to comprehend once you take it all in. It's one littered with stunning revelations and broken promises, and one that puts Missouri's years-long fight against overturning wrongful convictions directly in the spotlight. All right, before we get into the rest of the story, I just want to take a minute to say thanks for being here. This video you're about to watch is the culmination of months of work and years of work by a friend of mine before that. None of this would be possible without you and without today's sponsor, DeleteMe. The amount of information out there on everyone in this video and everyone that I research regularly is kind of alarming, all available at just a few clicks. The same actually goes for my own, which I kind of found out about after running DeleteMe's thorough search. Months ago, I had personally sent emails requesting to get my information removed from certain sites I had found it on, and thought I'd done a pretty good job, until DeleteMe search returned dozens more from data brokers that didn't even know existed. These profiles included things like social security numbers, recent addresses, information about my relatives, and a lot more. The first search they did here reviewed 2,000 listings and removed dozens of them on my behalf. Not only that, but they're going to routinely check to make sure my information isn't getting onto new sites and to new data brokers. And if it does, they're going to remove it on my behalf. On top of sponsoring this video, they're offering anyone who signs up 20% off using the link in the description below. Just go to joindeleteme.com/CoreyPop and use promo code CoreyPop at checkout for that 20% discount. If you're someone who worries about who has access to your data and what they might do with it, including harassment and identity theft, then let DeleteMe take care of that for you. Now, let's get back to the story. On August 11th, 1998, Felicia Gale, a 42-year-old former reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, was brutally murdered in her home in St. Louis, Missouri. She had been stabbed over 40 times. It mimicked a murder that had happened just 24 days before. Another woman, Deborah McLean, was murdered in her kitchen with a knife taken from the home, an eerily similar scene to Felicia Gale's murder. The investigation languished for months. Despite the similarities between the two murders, the knives being left at both scenes, there being bloody footprints in Gale's house, the police had little to go on. No eyewitnesses, no leads for either. Then, a year later, there was a break in the Gale case. It came in the form of a man named Henry Cole, a jailhouse informant who had said his cellmate had confessed to the murder. That eventually led to the arrest of Marcellus Williams, who was charged with Gale's murder. McLean's murder remains unsolved to this day, but Marcellus was in lockup, so he couldn't have done it. The case against Williams for Gale's murder was largely circumstantial.
This was a very brutal murder of a woman who was found in her home having been stabbed to death. There were bloody footprints at the crime scene, fingerprints, hairs found in the victim's hand, none of which matched Marcellus. Those were not his bloody footprints, those were not his hairs. And the fingerprints were destroyed.
The state's prosecution relied heavily on the testimony of 2 informants who had been incentivized to testify.
The only evidence they used to convict him is what we call incentivized informant testimonies. Individuals who came forward because they had something to gain.
The first was Cole.
So Marcellus had been in the workhouse, and someone who was incarcerated with him hears there's reward money and essentially says, I want this reward money and I want help with my own case, and says he won't even testify until he gets that reward money.
The second was Williams' former girlfriend, Laura Sorrow.
In addition, there's another individual, a woman who Marcellus was known to affiliate with. Notably, the 2 of them contradict each other in what they say would have happened and contradict physical evidence that's found at the crime scene.
The key piece of evidence brought against him was Gail's laptop, which he was said to have sold.
The last piece of evidence that they use is a laptop that had been taken from the victim's house that Marcellus did sell. But what wasn't presented at trial was that the woman that had come forward and said she had information and manufactured these statements about Marcellus is the person who gave him that laptop. And so it wasn't allowed to come out that really the only connection to the crime is this informant and not Marcellus Williams.
There were even eyewitnesses who had said they had seen Asaro with the laptop while Marcellus was still in county.
Usually in death penalty cases, the evidence of guilt is overwhelming, and the only real issue you can litigate in most cases is whether the death penalty was appropriately given. This case was different in that the evidence that they used to convict him was pretty thin and questionable.
All of this should have been easy to poke holes in for most attorneys, but these problems continued at trial. Since his conviction, Williams has argued in several motions that he received ineffective counsel during the trial, which came from a public defender assigned to him. It's no secret that America's public defender system has been stretched to its breaking point, but nowhere near as much as Missouri, which ranks 49th in the country in spending on indigent defenses. In 2017 alone, 320 public defenders handled 80,000 cases in the state of Missouri. The state has repeatedly vetoed bills that would supply funding to help alleviate this caseload.
The Missouri State Public Defender System is asking for more taxpayer money. They say thousands of defendants are on waiting lists because the office does not have enough attorneys to represent them.
It leaves people like Williams with inadequate counsel and inevitable outcomes like wrongful convictions.
Preparing a case for trial takes hundreds of hours if done properly. And if not done properly, then we end up with all these wrongful convictions.
At jury selection, Marcellus ended up with the mostly white jury when the prosecution struck 6 of the 7 qualified black jurors. When the trial was over, despite the questionable witnesses and the evidence being all circumstantial, they deliberated for less than 90 minutes before finding him guilty. There's something in the U.S. judicial system called a Batson challenge that is supposed to prevent the prosecution from striking qualified jurors on the sole ground of group bias. In this case, race. This was a black man being tried by an almost entirely white jury for a white woman's death in Missouri in the 1990s. When Marcellus' defense tried to argue Batson in a 2003 motion, the state indicated that the jurors were struck because the prosecution stated their clothing indicated they were trying to be different. But that was reason enough and not racially motivated, so Batson didn't apply. For years, Marcellus pleaded his innocence. His case was taken up by multiple different legal teams who fought tooth and nail to finally get the DNA that they had found on the knife properly tested. It turned out to be another man's profile.
There is a DNA testing statute in the Missouri law, but it's real narrowly written, so we just had to make that request and a broader claim of that he was innocent, or there's enough doubts about his innocence that he shouldn't be executed, and we can prove it if you let us do this further DNA testing.
It's not always a weapon like in Marcellus's case where it's left in the victim's body. That's a incredibly obvious piece of evidence. To know that that wasn't tested was just shocking. It just blew my mind. Don't you think you should test it before you execute this man? Went through the evidence. I produced my analysis, which was pretty simple. There was a clear male profile on the handle, not Marcellus Williams. To me, that seemed sufficient to reopen the case.
This went on for months without any movement. No evidentiary hearings, no chance to present this new evidence. Then, at the last minute, just hours before his execution, the Governor Eric Greitens decided to stay his execution.
Marcellus Williams would be dead tonight without Governor Eric Greitens issuing a stay of execution.
Marcellus remembers that day.
I was like maybe a couple of hours away from being executed. I actually seen the execution team go into the little room, with their little materials. I had already came to grips with that.
In staying the execution, Greitens cited the new DNA evidence and assigned a board of retired judges to convene and make a decision on if Marcellus deserved a new trial.
Governor Greitens will appoint 5 retired judges to the panel to review Marcellus Williams' case, including that new DNA evidence.
Everyone was hopeful.
It's looking way better than it was before. Anything better than him facing death penalty. So now he getting the chance and the shot he needed for them to look over the DNA evidence.
But the sentiment was short-lived because what happened following that was nothing short of stunning. The board of inquiry is something unique to the state of Missouri. It's a law that's been rarely invoked, and each of the few times it has yielded bizarre results. In the late 90s, the then governor Mel Carnahan issued a stay of execution and invoked the board of inquiry to look into the case of William Theodore Boliak Jr. Carnahan then died in a plane crash, and because of the wording in his stay, Boliak remains on death row to this day, with his execution being forever stayed. In Marcellus's case, the board of inquiry that then Governor Eric Greitens requested to convene did in fact meet. It was the first movement in a while and gave him and his legal team hope.
Are you hopeful now with this board inquiry?
I'm hopeful, but I don't believe or trust in the judicial system. But I'm hopeful that some good will come out of it one way or another. And I'll just leave it at that.
Marcellus's hesitation here, born of a lengthy and complicated legal process that had kept him behind bars for years, proved to be prescient. This hope was indeed short-lived because as the board began to meet, something happened.
Missouri Republican Governor Eric Greitens, once considered a rising star in the GOP, has just resigned this afternoon amid an impeachment effort sparked by a pair of scandals.
Today, I am announcing that I will resign as governor of Missouri, effective Friday, June 1st at 5 p.m.
When former Missouri Governor Eric Greitens issued that stay, he impaneled a special board to examine the facts of the case and make a recommendation. But then a personal scandal forced Greitens out, leaving the board in jeopardy and the future of Marcellus Williams entirely unclear.
The governor who succeeded Greitens, Mike Parson, came in as someone tough on crime, which caused many to believe the board was in jeopardy.
I remember CBS coming into town saying, what's going to happen with Marcellus Williams? Will you keep the board of inquiry still intact? And he said, I'm going to let them do what Greitens set them up to do.
I know the board was canceled. Will they meet? Will they make a recommendation to you? And what will you do then?
I would assume they would. I've heard they're not going to. So I think once they make that recommendation, if they do meet, then we'll discuss that at the time.
And now we found that that's not the case.
Parson, of course, dissolved the board, ending the state's years of work towards Marcellus obtaining a hearing. After everything Marcellus had been through, for his case to once again be thrown into turmoil for things outside of his control seemed unbelievable. How did the scandal-plagued governor of Missouri's resignation essentially ruin Marcellus's chances at freedom? The funny thing about Parson's tough-on-crime stance and these actions are that they only seem to apply to certain people in certain cases, further confounding how justice works within the state of Missouri. Parson has been granting pardons and clemency at an exceptional rate, more than any governor of Missouri since the 1940s. But this has a specific political tint to it. Parson's clemency only comes for people like Mark and Patricia McCloskey, the couple who became famous for waving guns at Black Lives Matter protesters.
Missouri Governor Mike Parson's office confirms his recent group of pardons and commutations include Mark and Patricia McCloskey. The St. Louis couple made national headlines last summer when they waved guns at demonstrators in their Central West End neighborhood.
As of August 2022, 90% of Parson's pardons have been white petitioners, which when you look at the demographics of those incarcerated in the state seems nearly impossible. For those outside of Parson's purview, the justice system seems to lean its full weight on them. Parson dissolved the board of inquiry looking into Marcellus's case and took no further action.
We filed a civil lawsuit saying we don't believe the governor has the authority to dissolve that board because he had to wait until they finished their work. Once they finished their work, he could do what he wanted with his clemency powers, but the order had already been there. Unfortunately, the Missouri Supreme Court disagreed with that and recently dismissed that civil case. And at that point, the Attorney General argued there was no other reason that an execution date shouldn't be set.
We're here now, and he's got a September execution date.
All of this speaks to how baffling the system in the state of Missouri is.
Missouri is one of the more difficult legal systems to navigate, in particular because of the opposition that every innocence case has faced.
Even when clear and convincing evidence emerges in a case, overturning a wrongful conviction here is an uphill battle.
I had a case, it wasn't a death row case, where the two witnesses who identified him as killing this guy both recanted their stories. We tried to get it back in front of the trial court here in Kansas City. The state opposed it, and the judge said, I can't hear this. Denied. And he's still in prison. We're still trying to get him out.
The appeals process in the United States is already a lengthy and complicated one, but in Missouri it is especially tough. There's strict filing deadlines, limited resources for post-conviction investigations, procedural barriers, restrictive criteria for DNA testing, and a high bar for introducing new evidence.
You can have a winning case and the court won't hear it because of a procedural default. And that happens time and time again. It's happened in Missouri numerous times. The guys have been executed without really any meaningful review of their cases because of that.
All of these hurdles have directly hindered Marcellus Williams' pursuit of the truth.
In Marcellus's case, we were not necessarily defaulted on a lot of stuff, but we were thwarted at every turn in trying to get court authorization to get access to evidence that could exonerate him.
Procedurally and legally, the state of Missouri is set up in a way that continually thwarts attempts to seek justice. But the power the Attorney General holds in the state further complicates things and leads to horrific situations that honestly shocked me the further I went down the rabbit hole. The Attorney General's office in the state of Missouri has fought tooth and nail against every appeal and every hearing in the last several decades.
When they fight it, they fight to just prevent a hearing from even happening. And that's what we see time and time again, this argument of finality over fairness. We just need to be done, and not that we just need to get it right. When you have an office that takes these really hardline approaches, there's not a lot of room for the facts or justice in those cracks in between.
Combined with the laws the state has enacted over these years, it has caused so many problems for those arguing wrongful convictions.
If you've got evidence that you got an unfair trial, or if you got or wrongfully convicted, it shouldn't matter that there's a procedural problem in the case. The court ought to hear it.
Just a few weeks ago, the AG's office blocked the release of Christopher Dunn, who had served 30 years for a crime he didn't commit.
Our top story, he was just minutes away from walking free. The 11th hour move by the Missouri Supreme Court, halting the release of Christopher Dunn.
A circuit court judge overturned his conviction on the basis that both eyewitnesses had recanted their stories. Dunn was set to be released, only to have Missouri's current AG, Andrew Bailey, block it through the Missouri Supreme Court.
On Monday, a St. Louis Circuit Court judge overturned his conviction, but Missouri Attorney General Andrew Bailey appealed his release. On Wednesday, that same judge overruled Bailey, but just as Dunn was about to get out, the Missouri Supreme Court halted it per Bailey's request. Kira says she doesn't understand why AG Bailey is fighting it so hard.
All of this takes courage, and it's rare. And to see another part of the state try to slap that down and try to kill it, I just don't understand it.
This comes just a week after Bailey attempted the same thing with Sandra Hemme, the longest-held wrongly incarcerated woman known in the U.S. Hemme's conviction was overturned only to have her release blocked by Bailey. Eventually, he was overruled and she was set free. In the wake of it, her attorney Sean Bailey said it shouldn't be this hard to free an innocent person.
It's just going to show how bad the system needs to be reformed. It is broken.
Absolutely. A judgment was made 35 days ago. She was innocent, but Attorney General Andrew Bailey fought her release in the courts until the judge ordered her release by 6 p.m. or he would hold the Attorney General in contempt.
Despite his conviction being overturned, Dunn remained behind bars because of the Attorney General's petitions.
We are overjoyed, and at the same time, we're also afraid to really exhale until Chris actually takes his first free steps.
The human cost of these systematic failures is staggering. Collectively, Missouri's exonerees have served hundreds of years behind bars for crimes they didn't commit. Families have been torn apart, lives derailed, and the true perpetrators were left to commit further crimes.
She says no family should have to go through what Christopher's family went through yesterday. She says tonight they are waiting and trying to keep hope as this entire legal process continues to play out.
Marcellus' son knows all too well about this pain. and the waiting, the keeping hope, the lengthy legal processes.
My dad in this up situation, I'm really got to be there for him. You know what I'm saying? You got to let your dad know you love him. You know, get somebody their roses while they still alive. These people want to put all the pressure. They make the visits uncomfortable. They make the lawyers run around in circles. You know what I'm saying? It's just too much.
Some studies indicate that 4 to 6% of the inmate population in America is actually innocent, which would mean that there could be hundreds more in Missouri behind bars for a crime they didn't commit. For a state that incarcerates its population at a rate higher than the national average and higher than most countries in the world, it needs to be sure it's getting these convictions right. Instead, it spent years railing against policies that would alleviate the problem and refuses to acknowledge any wrongdoing.
These people play games when they don't want to admit they wrongdoing, so it's the same story, new day, new book, you know, same shit, man.
The one strange thing Marcellus has on his side in this fight for innocence is doing it from death row.
Missouri is the only state in the country where if you can prove your innocence, you can get out of prison, but only if you were sentenced to death. So if you can prove your innocence and you were not sentenced to death, the courts essentially say we don't have any authority to do that.
In the 2016 ruling of Lincoln v. Cassidy by the Missouri Supreme Court, the court decided that freestanding claims of actual innocence, where a person asserts they are factually innocent of the crime for which they were convicted, even if there were no procedural errors in the trial, are only recognizable for individuals on death row. The decision effectively closed off a crucial avenue for potentially innocent prisoners serving non-death sentences to challenge their convictions based solely on new evidence of their innocence.
In 2016, the Court of Appeals in Missouri said it didn't matter essentially how strong the evidence of innocence was. The Missouri Supreme Court had only found innocence in a death penalty case, not in any other case, and so it did not have the power to overturn Rodney's conviction because he was not sentenced to death. That is still essentially the law today. Many individuals, myself included, have asked the Missouri Supreme Court to rehear this. They have declined to do so. And so what we see in cases like Rodney's or others in individuals is there's a very distinct partition between when we will hear evidence of innocence and when we won't.
The ruling in Lincoln v. Cassidy has had far-reaching consequences, as seen in cases like Christopher Dunn's, where compelling evidence of innocence exists but cannot be fully considered by the courts due to this precedent. For Marcellus, despite the fact he can present these freestanding claims of innocence, it has done little to help his case. It embodies every aspect of this broken justice system, and these failures very well could end in the execution of an innocent man. It's been 7 long years since the lab finally properly tested the DNA on the murder weapon found in Felicia Gale and proved it was not Marcellus Williams. It has been 7 long years since Marcellus Williams' lawyers have been seeking an evidentiary hearing to present this bombshell. And it has been 7 long years of the state of Missouri fighting this revelation like it has every other case.
Why not have the hearing, right? And the Attorney General's office has currently filed a motion to dismiss the prosecutor's motion to vacate, arguing that since an execution date has been set, it's too late, can't have a hearing.
Finally, after the execution date was set, the state decided it would allow an evidentiary hearing for the DNA evidence. Then, the AG, Andrew Bailey, filed a writ of probation to dismiss the hearing. The court rejected this, and the hearing will still proceed on August 21st, but not for lack of trying.
What's so disturbing about what's happening in Marcellus's case is that we have in January a prosecutor filing a motion to overturn his conviction on the basis of his innocence in January, and then just 6 months later, an execution date being set before a hearing on that motion has been held.
It's a very real possibility that because of the speed in which the courts work, that the results of the evidentiary hearing will not be known until after Marcellus Williams is executed on September 24th.
There's no coming back from an execution. And where there's DNA evidence and a prosecutor saying, I want a hearing on this DNA evidence because I believe this person is innocent, to not have that hearing, to just say it's too late, would really say something about what it means to try to seek justice in our system.
Beyond the convincing DNA evidence, the ineffective counsel, the contradicting eyewitnesses, something else has come to light. Notably, while Noah was making his documentary, a private investigator had spoken with Asaro before she had passed and said she had recanted her story, saying Marcellus had nothing to do with the murder.
Somebody was following Laura Asaro before she passed, but apparently she said he didn't do it.
It sounds to me like she said twice he didn't do it.
She died before they could get a sworn affidavit.
They tried to get an affidavit to her, and she passed before she could.
Even in spite of all that, all the other evidence in this case that points to Marcellus Williams' innocence should lead to his exoneration, or at least a new trial, but only time will tell if that happens. The governor of Missouri's AG will fight this case to the bitter end, and even if his conviction is overturned, they could block his release from prison, like they did Christopher Dunn and Sandra Hemme. Of course, on top of all this are the ethics of the death penalty, which are for another time.
Doesn't matter where someone stands on the death penalty here. If we want to have that system, there has to be the possibility for somebody to have their innocence heard before a step is taken that can never be undone.
This entire journey has disillusioned me on the justice system's approach to wrongful convictions, and even more so on Missouri's fight for finality over fairness. But it has also taught me that if a case gets enough attention, it very well could mean life or death for the person at the center.
He a good man, he an honorable man, and he an innocent man. So that's that.
Thanks again, DeleteMe, for making this video possible. I just wanted to also say thanks to Noah and his crew and all the work they did. If you want to know how to get involved, people to donate to, petitions to sign, congressmen to annoy, I've included some links down below. Be proactive. It's the only way anything changes in these situations. I appreciate you being here. I'll see you on the next one.